I knew the moment I stepped into the nursery that my life would never be the same. There, beneath the window where morning light spilled across the floorboards like split milk, stood 3 cradles instead of 2. The advertisement had been quite specific. The Duke of Ashford required a governess for his 2 young children following the death of their mother. I had responded to the notice with trembling hands, my situation desperate enough that I could not afford to be particular about the circumstances. My previous position had ended abruptly when the family discovered I had borne a child out of wedlock 3 years prior, a child I had been forced to give away before I ever held her properly in my arms. They dismissed me without references, and for 6 months I had scraped together what work I could find, mending clothes in the dim corners of London boarding houses, always 1 week away from the streets. The Duke's steward had interviewed me in a cramped office that smelled of old paper and pipe smoke. He was a thin man with spectacles that caught the light in sharp angles, and he asked me the usual questions about my education, my experience with children, my moral character. I lied about the last part, of course. I told him I was a respectable widow whose husband had died of consumption, leaving me alone in the world. He seemed to believe me, or perhaps he simply needed to fill the position quickly. Either way, he offered me the post at a salary that seemed almost too generous. The journey to Ashford Manor took 2 days by coach. I watched the landscape transform from the soot-stained buildings of London to the rolling green hills of the countryside, and with each mile I felt something loosening in my chest, as though I were shedding an old skin. The other passengers in the coach were a farmer's wife with a basket of eggs and a young clerk who kept glancing at me with poorly concealed interest. I ignored him and pressed my face to the window, watching the world slip past in shades of emerald and gold. When the coach finally deposited me at the gates of Ashford Manor, I stood for a long moment simply staring at the estate. It was larger than any house I had ever seen, built of grey stone that seemed to absorb the afternoon light. Tall windows looked out over manicured gardens, and beyond them I could see the dark line of a forest. The air smelled different here, cleaner, filled with the scent of grass and something floral I could not quite identify. I picked up my single worn trunk and walked up the long drive, my boots crunching on the gravel. A housekeeper met me at the servants' entrance. She was a stout woman with graying hair pulled back severely from her face, and she introduced herself as Mrs. Henshaw. She looked me over with sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every threadbare patch on my traveling dress, every scuff on my boots. I lifted my chin and met her gaze steadily. I had learned long ago that showing weakness only invited cruelty. Mrs. Henshaw led me through a maze of corridors, pointing out the kitchens, the servants' hall, the back stairs that I was to use at all times. The house was beautiful in a cold, formal way, all polished wood and heavy furniture and portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down from the walls. We climbed 3 flights of stairs to the nursery wing, and with each step I felt my heart beating faster. I told myself it was only nervousness about the new position, but some part of me knew it was something else, some premonition I could not name. The nursery suite consisted of 3 rooms, a large playroom filled with toys and books, a smaller room with 2 narrow beds, and the nursery proper where the children slept when they were infants. Mrs. Henshaw pushed open the door to this last room, and that was when I saw them. 3 white cradles arranged in a row beneath the tall window. The first 2 were clearly occupied. I could see the gentle rise and fall of blankets, hear the soft breathing of sleeping babies. But it was the 3rd cradle that held my attention. Mrs. Henshaw had already moved on, talking about feeding schedules and nap times, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. I walked slowly toward the 3rd cradle, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The baby inside was perhaps 6 months old, with a round face and dark curling hair. As I approached, the child opened her eyes and looked directly at me. They were the most remarkable eyes I had ever seen, a deep brown that seemed almost black in the dim light of the nursery. The baby did not cry or fuss. She simply gazed at me with an expression that seemed far too knowing for an infant. I heard Mrs. Henshaw stop talking. When I turned to look at her, her face had gone carefully blank, the way servants' faces do when they are pretending not to know something. I wanted to ask about the third baby immediately, but something in the housekeeper's expression warned me to wait. Instead, I smiled and said that the nursery was lovely, that I was sure I would be very happy here. Mrs. Henshaw nodded and resumed her tour, showing me my own small room just off the main nursery, a space barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, but blessedly private. That first evening I met the two older children, Charlotte and Henry, aged 4 and 6 respectively. They were beautiful children, with their mother's fair hair and their father's gray eyes, and they regarded me with the solemn wariness of young ones who had already learned that adults could disappear without warning. I sat with them in the playroom and read from a storybook, using different voices for the characters until Henry smiled and Charlotte giggled. It was a small victory, but it felt like something. I did not meet the Duke that day. Mrs. Henshaw informed me that His Grace was occupied with estate business and would likely not require my presence for some time. The children took their supper in the nursery, and I fed the baby in the third cradle, whose name I learned from the nursery maid was Rose. The girl who brought up the milk said nothing else about the child, and when I asked if Rose was a relation to the family, she mumbled something about not being her place to say and hurried away. That night, I lay in my narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. Through the open door, I could hear the soft breathing of the children, the occasional whimper of a dream. I thought about the baby with the dark eyes and wondered whose child she was. The Duke's late wife had been a fair-haired beauty, according to the miniature portrait that hung in the nursery. Charlotte and Henry resembled her strongly. But Rose looked nothing like them. Her coloring was entirely different, her features cast in a different mold. I told myself it was none of my concern. I was here to teach the children their letters and numbers, to ensure they were fed and clean and safe. Whatever secrets the Duke kept were his own business. But even as I thought this, I knew I was lying to myself. There was something about that baby that called to me, some recognition that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the deepest parts of my heart. The next 3 days passed in establishing routine. I woke with the sun and saw to the children's morning ablutions, dressed them in the clothes the nursery maid had laid out, supervised their breakfast of porridge and milk. Charlotte was shy, but eager to please, and she applied herself diligently to her lessons. Henry was more restless, prone to staring out the window at the gardens below, but he was bright and learned quickly when I could capture his attention. And always, always, there was Rose in her cradle, watching me with those dark, knowing eyes. I asked Mrs. Henshaw about the baby again on the third day. We were in the linen closet, counting sheets, and I tried to make my voice casual as I inquired whether Rose would eventually be moved to the children's bedroom with her siblings. The housekeeper's hands stilled on the pillowcase she was folding. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something like pity flicker across her face. "Rose is not the late Duchess's child," she said finally. "That is all I can tell you, Miss Ashworth. If you wish to know more, you must ask His Grace himself. But I did not see the Duke. 4 days became a week, then 2 weeks, and still he did not appear in the nursery wing. The children spoke of him rarely, and when they did, it was with a kind of awed reverence that suggested he was more myth than man. I learned from the other servants that he had been devastated by his wife's death in childbirth 2 years ago, that he had withdrawn from society almost entirely, that he spent his days managing his estates and his nights locked in his study with a decanter of brandy. I should have left well enough alone. I was being paid a generous salary, I had a roof over my head and food in my belly, and the children were beginning to trust me. But I could not stop thinking about Rose. Every time I lifted her from her cradle to feed her or change her, every time she wrapped her tiny fingers around mine, I felt something twist in my chest. She reminded me of someone, though I could not quite place who. It was the locket that finally gave me the answer. I had been tidying the playroom one evening after the children were asleep when I found it wedged between two floorboards near the window. It was small and tarnished, clearly old, and when I pried it open I found two miniature portraits inside. One was of a young woman with dark hair and dark eyes, her expression serious. The other was of a man I did not recognize, though something about the set of his jaw seemed familiar. I was still staring at the portraits when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy footsteps, a man's tread. I barely had time to slip the locket into my pocket before the door opened and the Duke of Ashford walked into the nursery for the first time. He was taller than I had expected, and younger. The children had spoken of him with such gravity that I had imagined an old man, but he could not have been more than 35. He was handsome in a severe way, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the color of winter storms. He wore his grief like a coat, visible in every line of his body, in the shadows beneath his eyes, in the tight set of his mouth. When he saw me standing there in the dim light of the playroom, he stopped short, and for a moment we simply stared at each other. "You are the new governess," he said finally. His voice was deep and rough, as though he did not use it often. "Yes, Your Grace, Miss Ashworth." I curtsied, acutely aware of the locket burning a hole in my pocket. He nodded once, curtly, and moved past me toward the nursery where the children slept. I followed at a respectful distance and watched as he stood over each cradle in turn. He touched Charlotte's hair with infinite gentleness, adjusted Henry's blanket. But when he came to Rose's cradle, he went very still. He stood there for what seemed like an eternity, looking down at the sleeping baby, and I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. I should have remained silent. A good governess knows when to speak and when to hold her tongue. But something about the anguish in his face, the barely controlled pain, made me reckless. "Your Grace," I said softly, "whose child is Rose?" He turned to me so quickly that I took an involuntary step backward. His face had gone white, then red, and for a moment I thought he might shout at me, might dismiss me on the spot. But instead, he seemed to crumple, all that rigid control dissolving like sugar in water. He sank down onto the chair beside the cradle and put his face in his hands. "Please," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Please do not ask me that." I stood frozen, uncertain what to do. This powerful man, this duke who commanded hundreds of servants and thousands of acres, was begging me for something I did not fully understand. I watched as his shoulders shook, as he fought for composure and failed to find it. Finally, he looked up at me, and I saw tears on his face. "I will pay you anything," he said. "Name your price. I will double your salary, triple it. I will give you a house, a settlement, whatever you require. Just please, please do not ask whose baby sleeps in that cradle. Do not speak of it to anyone. I cannot bear it if the truth comes out." I felt the locket heavy in my pocket. I thought about the portrait of the dark-haired woman, about Rose's knowing eyes, about the child I had given away 3 years ago, and suddenly, horribly, I understood. Or I thought I did. My mouth went dry and my heart began to race. "Your Grace," I whispered, "is Rose mine?" He stared at me, confusion replacing the anguish on his face. "What? No, of course not. How could you think that?" Relief flooded through me so intensely that I felt dizzy. But if the confusion was so profound, then whose child was she? I pulled the locket from my pocket and held it out to him with shaking hands. "I found this in the playroom," I said. "Is this woman Rose's mother?" The Duke looked at the locket, and his face went ashen. He took it from me, opened it, stared at the portraits inside. Then he closed it carefully and held it pressed against his chest. "Yes," he said quietly, "that is Rose's mother, and the man in the other portrait is Rose's father." "Then why is she here?" I asked. "Why is she in your nursery with your children?" He was silent for so long that I thought he would not answer. Outside, I could hear the wind picking up, rattling the window panes. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Finally, the Duke stood and walked to the window, keeping his back to me as he spoke. "Because the woman in that portrait was my wife's sister," he said, "and the man was my younger brother. They loved each other desperately, but my father would not allow them to marry. My brother had no fortune of his own, and my father had arranged a more advantageous match for Catherine. When she and Thomas ran away together, my father disowned them both. I never saw either of them again." He paused, and I heard him take a shuddering breath. "They died 6 months ago," he continued. "Influenza. By the time word reached me, they had already been buried in a pauper's grave. But the parish priest wrote to tell me about the baby, Catherine's baby, my wife's sister's child. I could not let her go to an orphanage. So I brought her here. But if anyone discovers the truth, if anyone learns that I am raising the child of my disgraced brother and my wife's dishonored sister, the scandal would destroy what remains of this family's name." I understood then the weight of the secret he carried, the impossible position he was in. Rose was his niece by blood, but acknowledging her would mean acknowledging the elopement, the disgrace, everything his family had worked to bury and forget. And yet he could not turn away from an innocent child. He had chosen love over reputation, though it might cost him everything. "I will not speak of it," I said quietly, "to anyone." "You have my word, Your Grace." He turned back to me, and I saw something like hope flicker in his eyes. "Why would you promise that?" he asked. "You could use this information to your advantage. You could demand anything from me." I looked at Rose, sleeping peacefully in her cradle, unaware of the complicated web of secrets and pain that surrounded her existence. "Because she is innocent," I said, "and because some secrets are kept not out of shame, but out of love." The Duke stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, some softening of the hard lines around his mouth. Then he nodded once and turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. "Thank you, Miss Ashworth," he said. And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving me alone with 3 sleeping children and the weight of a secret I had promised to keep. I sat down in the chair he had vacated, my legs suddenly unsteady. The locket lay on the small table beside the cradle, and I picked it up, studying the portraits again. Catherine and Thomas, 2 people who had loved each other enough to give up everything, only to die before they could build the life they had sacrificed so much to create. And now their daughter slept in this grand house, raised by a man who grieved not only for his wife, but for the brother he had lost to pride and circumstance. I thought about my own child, the daughter I had given away. I did not even know her name, did not know if she was healthy or happy or loved. For 3 years, I had carried that grief like a stone in my chest, and now here I was, caring for another woman's child, protecting another family's secret. The irony was not lost on me. But as I sat there in the quiet nursery, listening to the soft breathing of 3 innocent children, I felt something unfamiliar stirring in my heart. Perhaps it was hope, or perhaps it was simply the recognition that I had been given a second chance, that I could offer Rose the love and protection I had been unable to give my own daughter. Either way, I knew with absolute certainty that I would keep the Duke's secret, that I would guard this child as fiercely as if she were my own. I placed the locket back on the table and stood, smoothing my skirts. Tomorrow I would return it to wherever it belonged, some drawer or box where family treasures were kept hidden from prying eyes. But tonight, I simply tucked Rose's blanket more securely around her small body and whispered a promise into the darkness. "You are safe here, little one," I said. "Whatever storms may come, you are loved. And I will make certain you never doubt that, not for a single day of your life." The days that followed took on a strange new rhythm, as though the house itself had shifted on its foundations. The Duke began appearing in the nursery wing with increasing frequency, always in the late afternoon when the children were at their lessons. He would stand in the doorway watching us, his presence both comforting and unsettling. I noticed how his gaze would linger on Rose, how his expression would soften when she reached her small hands toward him. Charlotte and Henry responded to their father's attention with shy delight. They were hungry for his notice, I realized, these children who had lost their mother and nearly lost their father to grief. When he sat with us during their drawing lesson, Henry climbed into his lap without hesitation, and Charlotte pressed against his side, showing him her careful sketches of flowers and birds. The Duke held them as though they were made of spun glass, his large hands infinitely gentle on their small shoulders. I tried to remain unobtrusive during these visits, focusing on my mending or organizing the children's books. But I was always aware of him, of the way he moved through the room, of the deep timbre of his voice when he praised Charlotte's penmanship or answered Henry's endless questions about the estate. Sometimes I would look up and find him watching me, and in those moments something passed between us, some unspoken understanding that went beyond words. 3 weeks after our conversation in the nursery, the Duke asked me to join him in his study. Mrs. Henshaw delivered the message with raised eyebrows, and I could see the speculation in her face. I changed into my best dress, a dove-gray wool that was respectable, if not fashionable, and made my way through the house to the wing where the Duke conducted his business. The study was exactly what I would have expected. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, heavy furniture that spoke of masculine authority. A fire burned in the grate, and the room smelled of leather and tobacco and old paper. The Duke stood by the window, his back to me, looking out over the gardens. When I entered, he turned and gestured for me to sit. "Miss Ashworth," he began, then stopped. He seemed to struggle with something, his jaw working as though he were chewing on difficult words. Finally he said, "I wish to thank you for your discretion, for your kindness to the children, and particularly for your care of Rose." I inclined my head. "It is my duty, Your Grace, and my pleasure. They are wonderful children." He moved away from the window and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about the situation, about Rose's future. As she grows older, people will ask questions. Why she looks so different from Charlotte and Henry. Why there is no record of her birth, no announcement in the papers. I had thought perhaps I could claim she was a distant cousin, orphaned and taken in. But that lie has its own complications." I waited, sensing he had more to say. He stopped pacing and looked directly at me, and I saw something raw in his expression, some vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "There is another option," he said quietly, "one that would protect Rose and provide her with legitimacy, one that would silence the gossips and give her a future. But it would require a great sacrifice on your part, Miss Ashworth, and I have no right to ask it of you." My heart began to beat faster. I thought I knew what he was about to propose, and the impossibility of it, the sheer audacity, made me light-headed. "Your Grace," I began, but he held up a hand. "Hear me out," he said. "Please. If we were to marry, you and I, Rose could be presented as your daughter from a previous marriage. The story would be that you were widowed young, that you gave your child to relatives while you earned your living, and that upon our marriage you brought her to live with us. It would explain her coloring, her lack of resemblance to me, and it would give her the protection of my name and position." I sat very still, trying to absorb what he was saying. Marriage, to a duke, to a man who was still grieving his beloved wife, who needed a mother for his children and a shield for his scandalous secret. It was not a romantic proposal. It was a business arrangement, a transaction designed to protect an innocent child. And yet, the very idea of it made something flutter in my chest, some foolish hope I had no right to feel. "I have nothing to offer you," I said finally. "No fortune, no family connections, no reputation worth protecting. Why would you tie yourself to someone like me?" "Because I trust you," he said simply. "Because you have shown Rose more tenderness in 3 weeks than many women show their own children. Because you understand what it means to sacrifice for someone you love. And because I believe you are a woman of honor, Miss Ashworth, despite whatever circumstances led you to seek employment in my household." His words struck me like a physical blow. I realized then that he knew, or at least suspected, the truth about my past. That I was not the respectable widow I had claimed to be. That I carried my own secrets, my own shame. And yet he was offering me not condemnation, but salvation. A chance to redeem myself, to build a life, to mother not only Rose but Charlotte and Henry as well. "I cannot love you," he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only honesty. "My heart is buried with my wife, but I can offer you respect, security, and a place in this family. I can promise to treat you with kindness and dignity. And perhaps in time, we might find some measure of contentment together." I looked down at my hands, folded tightly in my lap. I thought about the child I had lost, about the years of loneliness and poverty, about the way Rose looked at me with those knowing dark eyes. I thought about Charlotte's shy smile and Henry's eagerness to please. I thought about the possibility of belonging somewhere, of having a purpose beyond mere survival. When I looked up, I found the Duke watching me with something like apprehension on his face. He was afraid I would refuse, I realized. This powerful man who commanded estates and servants was afraid of a lowly governess saying no. "I accept," I said quietly. "I will marry you, Your Grace. For Rose's sake, for the children's sake, and perhaps, if I am honest, for my own sake as well." Relief flooded his features, and for a moment he looked almost young. "Thank you," he said. "You cannot know what this means to me, what it will mean to them." We were married 3 weeks later in the private chapel on the estate. It was a small ceremony, attended only by the household servants and the local vicar. I wore a simple dress of pale blue silk that the Duke had commissioned for me, the finest thing I had ever worn. The Duke stood beside me in his formal clothes, his face solemn, and when we spoke our vows, his voice was steady and sure. I thought about his first wedding, which must have been a grand affair with hundreds of guests and all the pageantry that attended the marriage of a duke. This quiet ceremony in a dim chapel was nothing like that. But when he placed the ring on my finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother, I felt the weight of the promise we were making. That night, I moved my few belongings from the governess's room to the Duchess's chambers. They were vast and beautiful, with silk wallpaper and velvet curtains and a bed large enough to sleep 4 people. The Duke had made it clear that our marriage would be one of convenience only, that he would not expect or demand intimacy. He had his own chambers in the bachelor's wing, and he would continue to sleep there. I was to be the Duchess in name and in public, but in private we would maintain a respectful distance. I told myself I was grateful for this arrangement. I had not married for love after all, and the thought of sharing a bed with a man who still mourned his first wife seemed like a special kind of torture. But as I lay in that enormous bed on my wedding night, staring up at the canopy above me, I felt a loneliness so profound it took my breath away. I was a duchess now, mistress of this great house, mother to 3 children who were not my own. And I had never felt more isolated in my life. The next morning, I woke early and went to the nursery. Rose was already awake, gurgling happily in her cradle. I lifted her out and held her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "Today you become my daughter," I whispered to her. "Today I become your mother in the eyes of the world, and I promise you, little one, I will love you as though you came from my own body. I will protect you from every harm. You will never know abandonment or shame." Charlotte and Henry were delighted with the marriage. They called me Mama almost immediately, with none of the hesitation I had feared. I think they had been starved for maternal affection, and they attached themselves to me with the wholehearted trust of children who desperately need to believe in safety. I read to them for hours, taught them games and songs, held them when they cried for the mother they could barely remember. The Duke and I settled into a strange partnership. We took breakfast together each morning, discussing the children's progress and the small domestic matters of the household. We walked together in the gardens in the afternoon, always with the children between us, a buffer against any awkwardness. At dinner, we sat at opposite ends of a long table, making polite conversation about politics and estate business. To any observer, we must have seemed like a typical aristocratic couple, cordial but distant, united by duty rather than passion. But there were moments when I caught him looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. Once, when Rose reached for me during a meal, calling out in her baby voice, I saw tears in his eyes. Another time, when I was reading to Charlotte and Henry in the library, I looked up to find him standing in the doorway, simply watching us with a softness on his face that made my heart ache. I tried not to think about what it might mean. I tried to focus on my duties, on the children, on learning to manage a household far grander than anything I had ever imagined. The servants were respectful but wary, uncertain what to make of this woman who had risen from governess to duchess in a matter of weeks. Mrs. Henshaw was particularly cool, though she never openly defied me. I suspected she had been loyal to the first duchess and saw me as a usurper. 2 months after the wedding, the Duke's mother arrived for a visit. The Dowager Duchess was a formidable woman with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of ice. She looked at me as though I were something unpleasant she had discovered on the bottom of her shoe. At dinner that first night, she made her feelings abundantly clear. "I must say," she remarked, cutting her meat with surgical precision, "this marriage was rather sudden. One might almost call it unseemly. My son's wife has been dead barely 2 years, and already he has replaced her with a woman of questionable background." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Mother," he said warningly, "Miss Ashworth, that is, the Duchess, has been a blessing to this household. The children adore her." "The children," the Dowager said coldly, "would adore anyone who showed them attention. That does not make this person suitable to bear the title of Duchess of Ashford." I felt heat rising to my face, but I kept my voice level. "I understand your concerns, Your Grace," I said. "I know I am not what you would have chosen for your son, but I love Charlotte and Henry as though they were my own, and I will do everything in my power to honor the position I have been given." The Dowager turned her icy gaze on me. "And what of the other child?" she said. "The dark-haired baby in the nursery." "Rose, I believe she is called. Whose child is she, really?" The question hung in the air like a sword. I saw the Duke go very pale, saw his hands clench around his fork. I knew in that moment that his mother suspected something, that she had come here to ferret out the truth. And I knew with equal certainty that I could not let her succeed. "Rose is my daughter," I said clearly, "from my first marriage. I was widowed when she was just an infant, and I had to leave her with relatives while I worked. When His Grace honored me by proposing marriage, I was finally able to bring my daughter home. She is mine, Your Grace, and she is now part of this family." The Dowager studied me for a long moment, her eyes narrowed. Then she turned to her son. "Is this true?" The Duke met her gaze steadily. "It is exactly as my wife has said. Rose is her daughter, and therefore she is now mine as well. I will not tolerate any suggestion otherwise." His mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more. The rest of the dinner passed in tense silence. That night, after the Dowager had retired to her chambers, the Duke came to find me in the library. I was sitting by the fire, trying to calm my racing heart. He sat down across from me, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you said at dinner, for protecting Rose." I looked at him, at the shadows under his eyes, at the grief and guilt and fierce protectiveness that warred in his expression. "We are her parents now," I said, "both of us. And that means we stand together, no matter who asks questions or what they suspect." He reached across the space between us and took my hand. It was the first time he had touched me since our wedding, and the warmth of his skin against mine sent a shock through my entire body. His grip was strong and sure, and I felt something shift between us, some invisible barrier beginning to crack. "I do not deserve you," he said, his voice rough. "You have sacrificed so much, asked for so little. I wish I could give you more. I wish I could be the husband you deserve." "You have given me a home," I said. "You have given me children to love. You have given me a purpose. That is more than I ever thought I would have, Your Grace." "Thomas," he said, "when we are alone, please call me Thomas. I am tired of being Your Grace, tired of being the Duke. I want to be a man, sometimes. Just a man." I squeezed his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm, the calluses that spoke of a man who did not shy away from physical work. "Thomas," I said, testing the name on my tongue. "It suits you." We sat there for a long time, hands joined, staring into the fire. Neither of us spoke, but I felt something passing between us, some wordless communication that went deeper than language. When he finally stood to leave, he lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles. It was a formal gesture, courtly and proper. But there was nothing formal about the way his eyes met mine, nothing proper about the heat I saw flickering there. After he left, I sat alone in the library, my hand tingling where his lips had touched. I told myself not to be foolish, not to read too much into a simple gesture of gratitude. But my traitorous heart had already begun to hope. Hope that perhaps, in time, this marriage of convenience might become something more. Hope that the man who still grieved his first wife might someday find room in his heart for the woman who now bore her title. I went upstairs to check on the children before retiring. Charlotte and Henry were sleeping peacefully, their faces angelic in the dim light of the nursery lamp. Rose was awake, as she often was at this hour, and when she saw me, she smiled, her whole face lighting up with joy. I lifted her from her cradle and held her close, swaying gently as I hummed a lullaby my own mother had sung to me long ago. In the darkness of the nursery, with a child in my arms and the promise of something I dared not name warming my chest, I felt a peace I had not known in years. I had come to this house as a desperate woman with nothing to lose. But somehow, impossibly, I had found a family. I had found a purpose. And perhaps, though I barely dared to admit it even to myself, I was beginning to find love. The Dowager Duchess remained at Ashford Manor for 3 long weeks, and each day felt like walking across a frozen lake, never quite certain when the ice might crack beneath my feet. She watched everything I did with those cold eyes, cataloging every mistake, every moment of uncertainty. I knew she was looking for proof that I was unworthy of the title I now bore, and I was determined not to give her any. I threw myself into my duties with fierce dedication. I reviewed the household accounts with Mrs. Henshaw, learning which merchants the estate patronized and why. I met with the cook to plan menus that would showcase local ingredients. I visited the tenants' cottages with baskets of food and medicine, listening to their concerns about leaking roofs and sick children. The first Duchess had been beloved for her charity work, and I knew I would be compared to her at every turn. The tenants were kind to me, if somewhat reserved. They called me Your Grace and curtsied when I approached, but I could see the questions in their eyes. Who was this woman who had appeared from nowhere and claimed their duke? Where had she come from? What right did she have to fill the shoes of the lady they had mourned? I could not tell them the truth, of course. I could not explain that I had been desperate and alone, that their duke had offered me salvation in exchange for a lie. So I simply smiled and did my best to be useful, to show them through actions rather than words that I cared about their welfare. Thomas noticed my efforts. One evening, after I had spent the afternoon helping a tenant's wife nurse her feverish child, he found me in the library removing my mud-stained boots. "You went to the Merrick cottage today," he said. It was not a question. "Little Sarah had a fever," I replied. I brought willow bark tea and sat with her until she fell asleep. Her mother has 3 other children to care for and no help. He was silent for a moment, and when I looked up I saw something soft in his expression. "My wife used to do that," he said quietly. "Go to the cottages. Help with the sick children. The tenants loved her for it." I felt a pang in my chest, that old familiar ache of being compared to a dead woman. "I am not trying to replace her," I said, perhaps more sharply than I intended. "I am simply doing what seems right." "I know," he said, and he came to sit beside me on the settee. "I know you are not trying to replace her, but you remind me of her sometimes. Not in appearance or manner, but in spirit. In the way you see people, the way you care about those who have less than you. She would have liked you, I think. She would have been grateful that you are the one caring for our children." Our children. The word struck me with unexpected force. Not his children, not the children I had agreed to raise. Our children. As though in his mind we had truly become a family, bound together by more than legal documents and public lies. I reached out and touched his hand, a gesture that was becoming more natural between us. "Your wife sounds like she was a remarkable woman," I said. "I hope I can honor her memory through the life I build here." He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through mine. "You already are," he said, "more than you know." That night, after everyone else had retired, I found myself unable to sleep. I put on a wrapper and went to the nursery, as I often did in those wakeful hours. Rose was restless, whimpering softly in her cradle. I picked her up and carried her to the rocking chair by the window, settling her against my chest. She was getting bigger now, nearly 8 months old, and I marveled at how much she had grown since I first arrived at Ashford Manor. I did not hear Thomas enter. I was humming softly to Rose, rocking slowly back and forth, when I sensed his presence. He stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, his hair disheveled from sleep, or perhaps from running his hands through it, as I had noticed he did when troubled. "I could not sleep," he said quietly. "I thought I would check on the children. Rose was fussy," I replied, "but she is settling now." He came to stand beside the rocking chair, looking down at us. In the moonlight streaming through the window, Rose's features were soft and peaceful, her dark lashes casting shadows on her round cheeks. "May I hold her?" Thomas asked, and there was something vulnerable in his voice, as though he were asking for a privilege he was not certain he deserved. I stood and transferred Rose to his arms. He held her with practiced ease, this man who had raised 2 children already, and began to rock her gently. I watched as he gazed down at her, as his expression shifted from tenderness to pain, and back again. I knew he was thinking of his brother, of the child who should have been raised by her own parents in a home filled with love rather than secrecy. "She looks like Catherine," he said softly. "My wife's sister. She had the same dark eyes, the same sweet smile. But she has Thomas's chin, that stubborn set to her jaw. They were so young when they fell in love. Catherine was only 17, my brother barely 20. My father forbade the match, said Thomas was too wild, too irresponsible, that he needed to make his own fortune before he could think of marriage. But they could not wait. They ran away together, and my father swore he would never speak their names again." "Did you ever try to find them?" I asked. He nodded, still looking at Rose. "I hired investigators. I sent letters to every address I could find, but they had disappeared completely, changed their names perhaps, or gone abroad. And then, when I finally had word of them, it was too late. They were already dead. I never got to tell my brother that I forgave him, that I understood why he ran. I never got to meet Catherine's husband, to see if they were happy together despite everything they had sacrificed." His voice broke on the last word, and I saw tears sliding down his face. Without thinking, I reached up and wiped them away with my fingertips. He caught my hand and pressed it against his cheek, and we stood there frozen, connected by touch and shared grief. "You are giving Rose the life they would have wanted for her," I said softly. "You are loving her in their place. That is a gift beyond measure, Thomas. They would be grateful." He lowered Rose back into her cradle with infinite care, tucking the blanket around her small body. Then he turned to me, and in the moonlight I could see the struggle on his face, the war between duty and desire, grief and hope. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I find myself thinking of you constantly," he said. "When I wake in the morning, when I ride through the estate, when I sit at my desk pretending to review accounts. I tell myself it is merely gratitude, merely respect for the woman who has become such a devoted mother to my children. But I am beginning to suspect it is something more." My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew I should step away, should remind him that ours was a marriage of convenience, that he had promised me nothing beyond respect and security. But I was tired of pretending, tired of denying the feelings that had been growing in me since that first night when he had held my hand by the fire. "I think of you too," I admitted. "More than I should. More than is wise given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" he asked, taking a step closer. "That I am a duke, and you were a governess? That we married for practical reasons rather than love? Or that I swore my heart was buried with my first wife?" "All of those things," I said, but my voice was unsteady. "You loved her. You love her still. I cannot compete with a memory, Thomas. I cannot be her." He reached out and cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. "I do not want you to be her," he said. "I loved my wife with all the passion of youth, and I will always cherish her memory. But she is gone, and I am still here, and so are you. And what I feel when I look at you is not comparison or substitution. It is something entirely new, something I never expected to feel again." Before I could respond, before I could think or reason or talk myself out of what I wanted more than anything, he bent his head and kissed me. It was tender and searching, a question more than a declaration. I felt the world tilt and right itself, felt something inside me that had been closed for so long finally open. I kissed him back, my hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and for a moment there was nothing but the taste of him, the warmth of his body against mine, the rightness of being held after so many years of loneliness. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing hard. He rested his forehead against mine, his hands still cradling my face. "I have wanted to do that since the day you stood up to my mother at dinner," he said with a shaky laugh. "You were magnificent. I was terrified," I admitted. "I thought she would see right through our story." "But she did not," he said, "because you told the lie with such conviction that it became truth. Rose is your daughter now, in every way that matters, and Charlotte and Henry are your children. And I, though I have no right to ask it, would very much like to be your husband in truth, as well as name." I looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or obligation. But I saw only sincerity, only the quiet hope of a man who had learned to grieve and was now tentatively learning to live again. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, Thomas. I want that too." He kissed me again, less gently this time, with a hunger that matched my own. When he lifted me in his arms and carried me from the nursery to my chambers, I did not protest. And when he laid me on the great bed that had belonged to his first wife, I felt no ghosts between us, only the warmth of the present and the promise of a future I had never dared to imagine. We made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies with patience and care. He touched me as though I were precious, as though he wanted to memorize every curve and hollow. I had known physical intimacy before, in the brief affair that had resulted in my lost child, but this was different. This was not stolen passion in the dark, but a deliberate choice made in full light of day, or rather moonlight. This was two wounded people choosing to heal together. Afterward, we lay tangled in the sheets, his arm around me, my head on his chest. I could hear the steady beat of his heart, feel the rise and fall of his breathing. I knew I should feel guilty for displacing the memory of his first wife, but I felt only peace. She had been loved in her time, and now I would be loved in mine. There was room in his heart for both of us, I realized. Love did not work like a finite resource, used up and exhausted. It could grow and change and expand to encompass new people, new possibilities. "I love you," he said into the darkness. I did not think I would ever say those words again to anyone, but they are true. I love you, not because you care for my children or keep my secrets, but because you are brave and kind and real, because you make me want to be better than I am. I turned my face up to his and kissed him softly. "I love you too," I said. "I think I have loved you since that first night when you begged me not to ask whose baby slept in the third cradle, when I saw your pain and knew I would do anything to ease it." We fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and I slept more soundly than I had in years. When I woke in the morning, he was still there, watching me with soft eyes. "Good morning, Duchess," he said with a smile that transformed his whole face. "Good morning, husband," I replied, and felt a joy so profound it brought tears to my eyes. From that day forward, everything changed. Thomas moved his belongings to my chambers, and we became a true couple in every sense. We still maintained propriety in public, of course. He was the Duke, and I was his Duchess, and there were standards to uphold. But in private, we were simply Thomas and Eleanor, two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their separate griefs. The children noticed the change immediately. They could not have understood the complexities of adult relationships, but they sensed the new harmony between us. Charlotte began calling Thomas Papa again with more frequency, and Henry stopped flinching when his father touched him. Rose, with the intuition of infants, seemed to relax as well, as though she could feel the love that now surrounded her on all sides. Even the Dowager Duchess noticed, though she said nothing directly. On the morning of her departure, she summoned me to the drawing room for a private audience. I went with some trepidation, expecting a final lecture on my inadequacies. Instead, she studied me for a long moment and then said something that surprised me. "My son is smiling again," she said. I had thought I would never see that. "Whatever you have done, however you have accomplished it, I suppose I must be grateful." She paused, then added with some difficulty, "You are not what I would have chosen for him. But perhaps you are what he needed." It was not warm praise, but coming from her, it was tantamount to a blessing. I curtsied respectfully. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will do my best to make him happy. See that you do," she said crisply. "And take care of those children, all three of them. I do not care whose blood runs in their veins. They are Ashford's now, and they will be raised as such." After she left, I stood at the window and watched her carriage disappear down the long drive. I felt Thomas come up behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. "She likes you," he said, in her own terrifying way. I laughed and leaned back against him. "I will take what I can get." The weeks that followed were the happiest I had ever known. We established new rhythms as a family. Breakfast together in the morning room, with Charlotte and Henry chattering about their lessons and Rose banging her spoon on the table. Afternoons in the garden, where Thomas taught Henry to ride, and I taught Charlotte to recognize the different flowers. Evenings by the fire, reading aloud while the children played at our feet, and nights, precious nights, when Thomas and I would retire to our chambers and lose ourselves in each other. I learned his body as thoroughly as I learned his heart. The scar on his shoulder from a riding accident in his youth, the way his breath caught when I kissed the hollow of his throat, the sound of his laughter when I whispered something wicked in his ear. And he learned me in turn, discovering all the places I was sensitive, all the ways to make me gasp and shudder and cry out his name. But it was not only physical passion that bound us. We talked for hours, sharing stories of our pasts, our hopes for the future. He told me about his brother, about the guilt he carried for not defying their father, for not helping Thomas and Catherine run away together. I told him about my child, about the daughter I had given away, about the grief that had nearly destroyed me. "Do you ever wonder where she is?" he asked one night as we lay in bed. "Your daughter, whether she is happy, whether she thinks of you." "Every day," I said, "every single day. But I try to believe she is better off than she would have been with me. I had nothing to offer her then. No home, no security, no respectability. At least this way she has a chance at a good life." He pulled me closer, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "You gave her life," he said. "And then you gave her the greatest gift a mother can give. You let her go so she could have a better future. That takes more courage than I can imagine." I cried then, for the first time in years, for the child I would never know, for the years of loneliness and shame. And Thomas held me and let me cry, offering no false comfort, only his presence and his love. As spring turned to summer, we settled more deeply into our life together. The estate prospered under Thomas's careful management, and I found satisfaction in my role as Duchess in the small ways I could improve the lives of the tenants and servants. Charlotte and Henry thrived, growing stronger and more confident each day. And Rose, our precious Rose, began to take her first tentative steps, reaching out for Thomas or me whenever she needed support. One warm afternoon, as I sat in the garden watching the children play, I felt a presence beside me. I looked up to find Thomas standing there, his expression serious. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked. We walked to the far end of the garden, out of earshot of the children and their nursemaid. Thomas took both my hands in his and looked into my eyes with an intensity that made my heart race. "Eleanor," he said, "I have something to tell you. Something I should have told you long ago." I felt a flutter of fear. "What is it?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "The night we met, when you found the locket with Catherine and Thomas's portraits, I told you that Rose was their daughter. That was true. But there is something else, something I could not bring myself to tell you then. Catherine's last letter to me, the one that came with news of her death, contained a confession. She and Thomas were not married. They had planned to wed, but Thomas died before they could find a priest willing to perform the ceremony without her family's consent. Rose was born out of wedlock. She is, in the eyes of the law and society, illegitimate." I stared at him, processing this information. "But you brought her here anyway," I said slowly, "even knowing that if anyone discovered the truth, the scandal would be even worse than you feared." He nodded. "She is my brother's child, my wife's sister's child. I could not abandon her to an orphanage simply because her parents were not married. But Eleanor, this means that our lie about Rose being your daughter from a previous marriage is even more important. If anyone discovers she is Catherine's bastard child, she will be ruined. She will have no future, no prospects, nothing but shame." I understood then the full weight of the secret we carried, the enormity of what we were protecting. But instead of fear, I felt only determination. "Then we will make certain no one ever discovers it," I said firmly. "Rose is our daughter. She will be raised with every advantage, every opportunity. And when she is grown, she will marry well and live a happy life, never knowing the circumstances of her birth." Thomas cupped my face in his hands, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "How did I ever deserve you?" he whispered. "You did not," I said with a smile. "But I am here anyway." He kissed me there in the garden, with the afternoon sun warm on our faces and the sound of children's laughter in the distance. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was where I belonged. Not because of the title I bore or the house I lived in, but because of the man who loved me and the children who called me mother. I had come to Ashford Manor with nothing but desperation and lies, but I had found truth here, and love, and the kind of family I had always dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by a travel-worn messenger who refused to give his name. Mrs. Henshaw brought it to me in the morning room, where I was reviewing the week's menus with the cook. The envelope was cheap and water-stained. addressed to the Duchess of Ashford in a hand I did not recognize. Something about it made my stomach tighten with dread. I dismissed the cook and broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words brief and devastating. Your Grace, I write to inform you that I have information regarding the child you claim as your daughter. I know the truth of Rose's parentage, and I know the truth of your own past as well. If you wish these secrets to remain buried, you will meet me at the Swan Inn in the village of Millbrook this Friday at noon. Come alone and bring £500. If you fail to comply, I will take what I know to the newspapers. I trust you understand what that would mean for your family. The letter was unsigned. I read it 3 times, each word searing itself into my mind. Someone knew. Someone had discovered our secrets, and they meant to destroy us unless I paid them off. My first instinct was to go to Thomas immediately, to show him the letter and let him handle this threat. But the letter had been addressed to me specifically, and the blackmailer had mentioned my own past. That meant they knew about the child I had given away, about the lies I had told to secure my position as governess. If Thomas learned that I had deceived him from the very beginning, would he still love me? Or would he see me as just another liar, another person who had manipulated him for personal gain? I burned the letter in the fireplace and watched as the paper curled and blackened, the words disappearing into ash. Then I went to my chambers and counted the money in my private accounts. Thomas had been generous with my allowance, but I had saved most of it, never having developed expensive tastes. I had £300 in cash and jewelry. It would not be enough, but perhaps I could negotiate with the blackmailer, buy myself time to gather more. The next 3 days were torture. I went through the motions of my daily routine, caring for the children, managing the household, sitting beside Thomas at dinner. But inside, I was screaming with fear. Every time he looked at me with love in his eyes, I wondered if this would be the last time. Every time Rose reached for me, calling Mama in her sweet baby voice, I wondered if I would lose the right to hear that word. On Thursday evening, Thomas found me in the library. I had been staring at the same page of a book for half an hour, unable to concentrate. He came up behind me and kissed the top of my head, and I nearly broke down and told him everything. But the fear of losing him kept me silent. "Are you feeling well?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "You have been distracted these past few days." "I am fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Perhaps just a bit tired. The children have been particularly energetic lately." He sat beside me and took my hand. "If something were troubling you, you would tell me, would you not? We are partners, Eleanor. There should be no secrets between us." The irony of his words was like a knife to my heart. "Of course," I said, hating myself for the deception. "I would tell you." That night I barely slept. I lay beside Thomas, listening to his steady breathing, memorizing the warmth of his body against mine. At dawn, I rose and dressed carefully in a plain traveling costume that would not attract attention. I told Mrs. Henshaw I was going to visit a sick tenant and would return by evening. Then I ordered the carriage and set off for Millbrook with my heart pounding and £300 hidden in my reticule. The Swan Inn was a shabby establishment on the outskirts of the village, the kind of place where questions were not asked, and strangers came and went without notice. I arrived precisely at noon and was directed by a bored serving girl to a private room at the back. My hands were shaking as I opened the door. The woman sitting at the table was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and a hard face that might once have been pretty. She wore a faded dress and a shawl that had seen better days, and when she looked up at me, I saw a mixture of resentment and satisfaction in her eyes. "Your Grace," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "How kind of you to come. Please, sit down." I remained standing. "Who are you?" I demanded. "And how did you learn about Rose?" She laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "My name is Mrs. Hartley. Though I was Miss Catherine Hartley when I worked as a lady's maid in London, caring for the belongings of wealthy women who did not appreciate what they had. 3 years ago, I was employed by a certain Mrs. Whitmore, who ran a home for unwed mothers. Do you remember that place, Your Grace? Or perhaps you remember it better by the name you used then. Miss Eleanor Ashworth, though I suspect that was not your real name either. The room tilted around me. Mrs. Whitmore's home. The place where I had gone when I discovered I was with child, where I had lived in shame for 6 months before giving birth. I had thought those records were confidential, that no one would ever connect the desperate girl I had been with the Duchess I had become. I see you remember, Mrs. Hartley said with satisfaction. I was there the night you gave birth to your daughter. I was the one who took the baby away when you were too weak to protest, and I was also the one who, years later, happened to be visiting my sister in the village near Ashford Manor when I heard the most interesting gossip. It seems the Duke had suddenly married his children's governess, a woman named Eleanor Ashworth, and this woman had a dark-haired baby daughter who had supposedly been living with relatives. But I knew better. I knew that Eleanor Ashworth's daughter had been taken to an orphanage in London 3 years ago. So who was this child the new Duchess claimed as her own? I forced myself to breathe, to think. She knew about my past, but she was guessing about Rose. She did not have proof of the child's true parentage, only suspicions. That was something, at least. What do you want? I asked. She smiled, showing yellowed teeth. I told you in the letter, £500, and I will forget everything I know. I will disappear, and you will never hear from me again. I only have 300, I said, pulling the money from my reticule and placing it on the table. But I can get more. Give me a month, and I will have the full amount. She counted the bills quickly, then looked up at me with narrowed eyes. 2 weeks, she said. Not a month. Bring the rest to this same place, same time, 2 Fridays from now. And Your Grace, she added as I turned to leave, do not think of bringing the authorities. I have left a sealed letter with a solicitor to be opened in the event of my death or disappearance. Everything I know is written there. If anything happens to me, your secrets will be exposed anyway. I left the inn feeling sick and hollow. I had bought myself 2 weeks, but at what cost? I could not continue to pay this woman forever. She would bleed me dry and still might betray me in the end. Blackmailers never kept their word. I knew that. And yet, what choice did I have? The carriage ride back to Ashford Manor seemed to take forever. I stared out the window at the passing countryside and tried to think of a solution. I could tell Thomas the truth, throw myself on his mercy, and hope he would forgive me. But would he? I had lied to him about my past, had accepted his proposal under false pretenses, and while he might forgive that, he would never forgive me for putting Rose at risk. If Mrs. Hartley went to the newspapers with her story, even her half-truths and suspicions would be enough to start an investigation. And any investigation into Rose's background would eventually uncover the truth about Catherine and Thomas, about the elopement and the illegitimate child. I could run away, take the children, and disappear. But where would we go? How would we survive? And what would that do to Charlotte and Henry, to tear them away from their father and the only home they had ever known? By the time I arrived back at the manor, I had made my decision. I would find the money, pay Mrs. Hartley, and pray that she kept her word. And I would keep this burden to myself, protecting my family the only way I knew how. But Thomas was waiting for me in the entrance hall when I arrived, and one look at his face told me something was wrong. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. "Mrs. Henshaw said you went to visit a tenant, but I checked with the estate manager, and there are no reports of illness." I tried to think of a plausible lie, but my mind was blank with exhaustion and fear. I hesitated too long, and I saw suspicion flicker in his eyes. "Eleanor," he said more gently, "please, tell me what is going on." And suddenly I could not bear it any more. I could not carry this alone, could not continue to lie to the man I loved. The words poured out of me in a rush. Everything about Mrs. Hartley and the blackmail and my terror of losing him and the children. I told him about the home for unwed mothers, about the baby I had given away, about the lies I had told to secure the position as governess. I told him all of it, holding nothing back, and when I finished, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. Thomas said nothing for a long moment. His face had gone very pale, and I could not read his expression. Finally, he took my arm and led me to his study, closing the door firmly behind us. Then he poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed me one. "Drink," he ordered, and I obeyed, grateful for the burn of alcohol in my throat. He sat down across from me and stared into his glass. "You lied to me," he said quietly. "From the very beginning. You lied about who you were, about your past, about being a widow. Everything I thought I knew about you was false." I felt tears spilling down my cheeks. "I know," I whispered. "I am so sorry, Thomas. I was desperate. I had nothing, no prospects, no hope. And when the opportunity came to work for you, I took it. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to fall in love with you." He looked up at me then, and I saw pain in his eyes. "Do you truly love me?" he asked. "Or was that a lie as well?" I crossed the space between us and knelt at his feet, taking his hands in mine. "That was never a lie," I said fiercely. "I love you more than I have ever loved anyone. You and the children are everything to me. I would die before I let anyone hurt this family." He pulled me up onto his lap and held me tightly, his face buried in my hair. "I was so afraid I had lost you," he said, his voice muffled. "When you went out this morning without explanation, when you lied about where you were going, I thought perhaps you had grown tired of this life, of me. I thought you were leaving." "Never," I said, clinging to him. "I will never leave you. I went to meet the blackmailer because I thought I could handle it alone, because I was afraid of losing you if you knew the truth." He pulled back and looked at me sternly. "You should have come to me immediately. We are partners, Eleanor. That means we face threats together, not separately. Do you understand?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He kissed me gently, then set me aside and stood up. "We need to deal with this Mrs. Hartley," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when managing estate business. "But we will not do it by paying her off. Blackmailers never stop demanding money. We need a more permanent solution." Over the next week, Thomas worked behind the scenes to investigate Mrs. Hartley. He hired a discreet inquiry agent who discovered that she had been dismissed from her position at Mrs. Whitmore's home for theft, that she had a history of petty crimes and extortion attempts, that she was desperate for money to pay gambling debts. Armed with this information, Thomas arranged a meeting with her, bringing not money, but a proposition. I insisted on being present, though Thomas tried to argue against it. We met her again at the Swan Inn, but this time Thomas brought his solicitor and 2 large footmen. Mrs. Hartley's face went white when she saw we had not come alone. Thomas laid out the evidence of her crimes in cold, precise detail. Then he made her an offer. She would leave England immediately, sail to America on a ship Thomas would pay for, and never return. In exchange, she would sign a legal document swearing that she had no knowledge of any scandals involving the Duke of Ashford or his family, and that any claims she had made to the contrary were lies told in an attempt to extort money. If she refused, or if she ever tried to return to England or contact our family again, Thomas would ensure she was prosecuted for her previous crimes. He had friends in high places, he explained calmly, and he would use every resource at his disposal to see her imprisoned. Mrs. Hartley tried to bluster, to threaten, but she could see she was defeated. She signed the document, took the money Thomas offered for passage, and within a week she was gone. The inquiry agent confirmed she had boarded a ship to New York, and Thomas received word a month later that she had arrived safely and taken up residence in that city. The threat was over, but something had shifted between Thomas and me. He had forgiven me for my lies, had protected me and our family without hesitation. But there was a new wariness in his eyes sometimes, a small distance that had not been there before. I knew I would have to work to rebuild the complete trust we had once shared. One night, as we lay in bed, he broke the silence that had fallen between us. "Tell me about her," he said quietly. "About your daughter, the one you gave away." I took a shaky breath. "She would be 3 years old now," I said. "I held her for only a few minutes before they took her away. She had dark hair and the most beautiful eyes. I named her Grace, though I do not know if her new family kept that name. I hoped she would grow up gracious and kind, everything I could not give her." "Do you want to find her?" he asked. "To know where she is, whether she is well." I had never allowed myself to consider that possibility. It seemed too dangerous, too likely to disrupt whatever life she had built with her adoptive family. But now, with Thomas beside me, I felt brave enough to admit the truth. "Yes," I whispered, "more than anything. But I am afraid. Afraid she will not want to know me. Afraid that seeing her will break my heart all over again." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I could hire investigators, discreetly. We could find out where she is, make certain she is being cared for properly. And then, when the time is right, when she is old enough to understand, we could tell her the truth. That her mother loved her so much she gave her up so she could have a better life. That she has always been wanted, always been missed." Tears streamed down my face. "You would do that?" I asked. "After everything, after all my lies, you would help me find my daughter?" He kissed my forehead, my cheeks, my lips. "You are my wife," he said simply. "Your pain is my pain. Your joy is my joy. If finding your daughter will give you peace, then we will find her, together." In that moment, I loved him more than I had thought possible. This man who had every reason to resent me, to doubt me, was instead offering me the one thing I wanted most in the world. I held him tightly and whispered my gratitude into his skin, and he held me back with steady strength. The next morning, Thomas hired the inquiry agent again, this time to search the records of orphanages and adoption societies in London. It took 6 weeks, but finally, word came. My daughter had been adopted by a merchant family named Clark, who lived in a respectable neighborhood in the city. The agent reported that the child was healthy and happy, well-dressed and well-fed, clearly loved by her new parents. Her name was now Amelia Clark, and she attended a small school for young ladies where she was reportedly doing well. I sat in Thomas's study and read the report with shaking hands. My daughter was alive. She was safe. She was loved. It was everything I could have hoped for, and yet it broke my heart all over again. She had parents now, a family, a life that did not include me. I had given her up so she could have opportunities I could not provide, and it had worked. But the cost had been so high. Thomas came to stand behind me, his hands on my shoulders. "We can write to them," he said, "the Clarks. We can explain who you are, ask if they would be willing to let you meet Amelia. Not to take her from them," he added quickly, seeing the alarm on my face, "but simply to know her, to be part of her life in some small way." "Would they agree to that?" I asked. "Would they risk it?" "I do not know," he admitted. "But we can ask. And if they refuse, at least you will know she is well. That has to be worth something." Over the next month, we composed a careful letter to Mr. and Mrs. Clark, explaining my circumstances and my desire to meet the daughter I had given up. We assured them we had no intention of disrupting Amelia's life or challenging their parental rights. We simply asked for the opportunity to know her, perhaps to write to her occasionally, to watch from a distance as she grew up. It was the hardest letter I had ever written, filled with apologies and hopes and barely suppressed longing. The response came 3 weeks later. Mr. Clark wrote that he and his wife had discussed our request at length, and they had decided to allow a meeting. They recognized that Amelia would someday have questions about her birth parents, and they believed it would be better for her to have answers rather than mysteries. They invited us to call on them in London the following month, and they would introduce me to Amelia as a family friend. If all went well, they would consider telling her the full truth when she was older. I wept when I read that letter, overcome with gratitude and terror in equal measure. Thomas held me and promised that whatever happened, we would face it together. And I believed him. After everything we had been through, all the secrets and lies and threats, we had emerged stronger. Our love had been tested and had not broken. Our family had been threatened and had survived. As autumn deepened and the first frost touched the gardens of Ashford Manor, I found myself looking forward rather than back. In a few weeks, I would meet my first daughter, the child of my body, if not my raising, and I would introduce her to her 3 siblings, Charlotte and Henry and Rose, who had given me back the chance to be a mother. I did not know what the future held, but I knew I would not face it alone. I had Thomas beside me, steady and true. I had children who called me Mama. I had a home and a purpose and a love that had conquered every obstacle placed in its path. That was more than enough. That was everything. The journey to London took 2 days, and every mile brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Thomas sat beside me in the carriage holding my hand, offering silent support as I wrestled with my fears. What would I say to this child who was mine and yet not mine? How would I look into her eyes without weeping? How could I meet her and then let her go again? We had left Charlotte, Henry, and Rose at Ashford Manor under Mrs. Henshaw's watchful care. I had kissed each of them goodbye that morning, holding them perhaps a moment too long. Charlotte had sensed my nervousness and clung to my skirts, asking when I would return. Soon, my darling, I had promised her. Very soon. The Clark family lived in a handsome townhouse in Bloomsbury, the kind of solid, respectable dwelling that spoke of comfortable prosperity without ostentation. When our carriage pulled up in front of the address, I found I could not move. My hands were frozen in my lap, my breath coming in short gasps. Thomas squeezed my fingers gently. "You do not have to do this," he said softly. "We can turn around right now, and no one will think less of you." But I shook my head. I need to see her. Even if it breaks my heart, I need to know she is real and whole and loved. He helped me down from the carriage, and together we climbed the steps to the front door. A maid answered our knock and showed us into a pleasant drawing room filled with afternoon light. The furnishings were comfortable rather than grand, and I noticed children's books stacked on a side table, a half-finished embroidery project abandoned on a chair. This was a home where people actually lived, not just a showplace for entertaining guests. Mr. and Mrs. Clark entered a moment later. He was a stout man in his 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair. She was younger, perhaps 40, with a warm smile and gentle manner. They greeted us with courtesy, and, I thought, some nervousness of their own. "Your Grace," Mr. Clark said, bowing to Thomas. "Your Grace," he added, turning to me. "We are honored by your visit. Please, sit down." We took our seats, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Clark leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I want you to know," she said to me, "that we have loved Amelia as though she came from my own body. When we took her from the orphanage 3 years ago, she was so small, so fragile, but she has grown into the most wonderful child, bright and curious and full of life." Tears were already sliding down my face. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for giving her everything I could not." Mrs. Clark's own eyes were wet. "We understand this must be difficult for you," she said. "We cannot imagine the courage it took to give up your child so she might have a better life. And we want you to know that we will never speak ill of you to Amelia. When the time comes to tell her the truth, we will make certain she understands that you loved her enough to make an impossible choice." Thomas spoke then, his voice steady and calm. "My wife and I have no desire to disrupt Amelia's life or to confuse her about who her parents are. We would simply like the opportunity to know her, perhaps to write to her occasionally. And someday, when she is older, to tell her that she has siblings who would very much like to meet her. Mr. Clark nodded slowly. "We have discussed this at length," he said, "and we believe it is the right thing to do. Amelia is a perceptive child. She already asks questions about where she came from, why she does not look like us. We think it would be better for her to have answers rather than mysteries." He stood and went to the door. "Shall I fetch her?" he asked, looking at me. I could not speak. I simply nodded, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Thomas moved closer to me on the sofa, his arm around my shoulders, and I leaned into his strength. The wait seemed endless, though it could only have been a minute or two. Then the door opened, and she walked in. She was perfect. 3 years old, with dark curling hair and eyes the color of rich earth. She wore a little pink dress with white lace at the collar, and her small shoes were polished to a shine. She looked healthy and happy and completely at ease in her world. When she saw me, she stopped and tilted her head, studying me with solemn curiosity. "Amelia," Mrs. Clark said gently, "these are the Duke and Duchess of Ashford. They have come to visit us today." "Hello," Amelia said, dropping a perfect little curtsy. She had been well taught, this child of mine. She had manners and confidence and security. "Hello, Amelia," I managed to say, though my voice shook. "What a lovely curtsy. Did your mama teach you that?" She nodded proudly. "And Papa taught me to count to 100. Would you like to hear?" Before I could respond, she launched into her recitation, her small voice serious and concentrated as she worked through the numbers. I watched her face, memorizing every feature, every expression. She had my eyes and nose, but her smile was entirely her own, bright and unguarded. When she finished counting, she looked up at me expectantly, waiting for praise. "That was wonderful," I said, my voice thick with tears I was fighting to contain. "You are a very clever girl." She beamed at me, then noticed Thomas. "Are you really a duke?" she asked him with wide eyes. "I am," Thomas said solemnly. "And do you know what that means?" She shook her head, her curls bouncing. "It means I have a very large house with many rooms and beautiful gardens, and I have 3 children who live there with me. A boy named Henry who is 6, a girl named Charlotte who is 4, and a baby named Rose who is learning to walk." Amelia's eyes grew even wider. 3 children? That must be very noisy. Thomas laughed, a genuine sound of delight. "It is indeed, but it is a good kind of noise. The noise of a happy home." I could see Mrs. Clark watching me carefully, assessing how I was managing. I forced myself to smile, to be calm, even though everything in me wanted to grab this child and run, to take back the 3 years I had missed, to reclaim what I had given away. But I had made my choice, and the Clarks had given her a life I never could have provided. This brief meeting was more than I had any right to expect. "Amelia," Mr. Clark said, "why do you not show the Duchess your drawings? You've been working so hard on them." She ran to a cabinet and pulled out a stack of papers, bringing them to me with obvious pride. I spread them on my lap and examined each one carefully. They were typical child drawings, stick figures and lopsided houses and bright splashes of color. But to me they were treasures, evidence of her creativity and imagination. I praised each one, asking questions about the people and places she had depicted, and she answered eagerly, climbing up on the sofa beside me without any shyness. For an hour we talked and played. Thomas engaged Mr. Clark in conversation about business, giving me time alone with Amelia and Mrs. Clark. I learned that Amelia loved stories about princesses and dragons, that she was afraid of thunderstorms but brave about spiders, that her favorite food was strawberry jam on toast. Mrs. Clark shared these details generously, understanding what they meant to me. When it was time to leave, I knelt down so I was at Amelia's eye level. "It has been such a pleasure to meet you," I said. "You are a wonderful girl, and I hope we might see each other again someday." She looked at me with those knowing eyes, so like Rose's, and said something that pierced my heart. "You look sad," she observed. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, darling," I said quickly. "You did nothing wrong. You are perfect. I am sad only because I must leave. But I'm also very happy because I got to meet you." She considered this, then threw her small arms around my neck in a spontaneous hug. "I will draw you a picture," she announced, "and Mama can send it to you at your big house." "I would love that," I whispered, holding her close for just a moment, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her small body. Then I released her and stood, knowing that if I did not leave now, I would not be able to leave at all. In the carriage on the way back to our hotel, I broke down completely. Thomas held me as I sobbed, all the grief and love and loss pouring out of me in great wrenching waves. I had seen my daughter. She was healthy and happy and loved. It was everything I had hoped for and everything that tore my heart to pieces. "She is beautiful," Thomas said when my tears finally subsided, "and she is clearly thriving. The Clarks are good people, Eleanor. They love her as their own." "I know," I said. "I know, and I am grateful. But it hurts so much to see what I gave up, to know what I missed." He kissed my forehead. "You gave her life twice," he said. "Once when you bore her, and once when you let her go, so she could have the childhood you could not provide. That is the most selfless love imaginable." We stayed in London for 3 more days, and the Clarks invited us to call twice more. Each visit was both a gift and a torment. I watched Amelia play and laugh and chatter, and I stored up every moment in my memory. On our last visit, Mrs. Clark took me aside while the men and Amelia were in the garden. "We have decided," she said, "that when Amelia is 10 years old, we will tell her the truth about her birth. She will be old enough then to understand, we think. And if she wishes to know you better, to visit your home and meet her half-siblings, we will not stand in her way. You will always be welcome in our home, Your Grace. Amelia is our daughter, but she is also yours. There is room in her life for all of us. Her generosity undid me. I embraced her, this woman who had given my daughter the life I could not, and I thanked her through my tears. We were not rivals, I understood then. We were both mothers to the same child, each of us loving her in our own way, each of us wanting only her happiness. The journey back to Ashford Manor felt different from the journey out. I was no longer consumed by anxiety and dread. Instead, I felt a bittersweet peace. I had seen Amelia. I knew she was loved. And someday, when she was ready, I would be able to tell her the truth and perhaps build a relationship with her. It was not what I had lost, but it was something. It was hope. Charlotte, Henry, and Rose greeted our return with wild enthusiasm, throwing themselves at us the moment we walked through the door. I scooped them up, all 3 of them, and held them tight. These children were mine too, not by blood, but by choice and love. I was their mother in every way that mattered, just as I was Amelia's mother in the secret places of my heart. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas and I walked through the gardens in the moonlight. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the bare branches of the trees cast intricate shadows on the ground. He took my hand, and we walked in comfortable silence for a while, simply being together. "I have been thinking," he said eventually, "about the future, about what we will tell the children when they are older, about Rose, about Amelia, about all the complicated truths that bind us together." I squeezed his hand. "What have you decided?" "That we will tell them the truth," he said. "All of it. When they are old enough to understand, we will explain about Rose's parents, about how we brought her into our family, because she had nowhere else to go. We will tell them about Amelia, about how sometimes love means letting go so someone can have a better life. We will teach them that families are not just about blood, but about choice and commitment and love that endures." "And what if they judge us?" I asked. "What if they think we were wrong to lie, to keep secrets? Then we will accept their judgment, he said simply. But I do not think they will. I think they will understand that we did what we thought was best, that we protected each other and them the only way we knew how. And I think they will see that despite all the deception, despite all the secrets, we built something true and good. A family that loves fiercely and protects its own. We stopped walking and he turned to face me, taking both my hands in his. I never expected to love again after my first wife died, he said. I thought that part of my life was over. But you have given me back joy, Eleanor. You have given me a reason to look forward rather than back. You and the children are my entire world, and I would go through everything again, all the pain and fear and uncertainty, if it meant ending up here with you. I reached up and touched his face, this man who had saved me in so many ways. I came to this house with nothing, I said. No hope, no future, no belief that I deserved love or happiness. But you gave me all of that. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You taught me that I was worthy of being loved, that my past did not have to define my future. You are the best man I have ever known, Thomas, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that you chose me. He kissed me then, deep and tender, and when we finally pulled apart, we were both smiling through our tears. We walked back to the house hand in hand, and I looked up at the windows of the nursery where our 3 children slept safe and warm. Somewhere in London, Amelia was sleeping too, tucked into her bed by parents who loved her. I could not have all 4 of my children under one roof, but I could love them all equally, each in their own way. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were illnesses and accidents, disagreements and disappointments, all the normal struggles of family life. But we faced them together, Thomas and I, united by love and shared purpose. Charlotte grew into a thoughtful young woman with a gift for music. Henry became a serious boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. Rose bloomed into a beautiful, spirited child who knew nothing of the scandalous circumstances of her birth, only that she was cherished beyond measure. And Amelia, our secret daughter, grew up in London with letters arriving twice a year from a duchess who took an unusual interest in a merchant's adopted child. On her 10th birthday, as promised, the Clarks told her the truth. She wrote to me the next day, a short letter in careful handwriting that said simply, "Thank you for giving me life. I would like to know you better, if you would like to know me." That summer, she came to visit Ashford Manor for a month, and I introduced her to her half-siblings. They accepted her instantly, delighted to have another sister, and by the end of her stay, they were inseparable. She came every summer after that, and slowly, carefully, we built a relationship. Not the relationship I would have had if I had kept her, but something precious nonetheless. She called Mrs. Clark Mama and called me Eleanor, and I was content with that. She knew I loved her, and that was enough. On Rose's 18th birthday, Thomas and I told her the truth about her parentage. We explained about her mother Catherine and her father Thomas, about the love that had driven them to defy convention, about the tragedy that had taken them too soon. We expected shock, perhaps anger at having been deceived. Instead, Rose wept and embraced us both. "Thank you for loving me enough to keep me," she said. "Thank you for protecting me from shame and giving me a family. You are my real parents, the ones who raised me and loved me and made me who I am. Nothing else matters." I looked at Thomas over her dark head, and I saw the same relief and love in his eyes that I felt in my heart. We had done it. We had kept our promises. We had protected these children and given them the lives they deserved. And in doing so, we had built something stronger than blood, stronger than duty. We had built a family founded on love. Now, as I sit in the drawing room of Ashford Manor with silver in my hair and grandchildren playing at my feet, I look back on the day I first walked into the nursery and saw 3 cradles instead of 2. That moment changed everything. It brought me Thomas and our children, brought me redemption and love, and a life beyond anything I had dared to imagine. Charlotte is married now to a kind country gentleman, and they have given us 2 beautiful grandchildren. Henry manages the estate with his father, preparing to take over when the time comes. Rose married for love, just as her parents did, and she is blissfully happy with a young doctor who adores her. And Amelia, our complicated gift, divides her time between London and Ashford Manor, bringing her own children to play with their cousins. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, Thomas and I walk through the nursery wing where it all began. The 3 cradles are long gone, replaced by beds for visiting grandchildren. But I remember them as clearly as if they were still there. The first cradle for Charlotte, the second for Henry, and the third for Rose. The third cradle that should not have existed, that held a secret we were willing to sacrifice everything to protect. I found that third cradle, and the Duke begged me not to ask whose baby slept there. But I did ask, and the answer led me here, to this life, to this love, to this family that was built on secrets and sealed with truth. I would not change a single moment, not the lies or the fear or the pain, because they all led me home. Thomas takes my hand as we stand in the doorway of the empty nursery, and I lean against him. This man who has been my partner and my love for more than 30 years. We have grown old together, weathered every storm, celebrated every joy. And through it all, we have never forgotten the children who brought us together, who taught us that family is not about perfection or appearances, but about love that endures. The third cradle saved me. It gave me purpose when I had none, hope when I had lost all belief in the future. It brought me a family I did not deserve and a love I never expected. And now, at the end of my life, I can say with absolute certainty that I have been blessed beyond measure, not because my path was easy, but because I found people worth walking it with. Not because I never made mistakes, but because I was forgiven for them. Not because I was born to privilege, but because I was given the chance to build something meaningful from nothing. I was a governess who became a duchess. I was a woman with nothing who found everything. I was a mother who lost a child and gained 4 more. I was lost, and then I was found. And it all began with a question I was warned not to ask, and a secret I promised to keep. The third cradle changed my life, and I will be grateful for it, and for the Duke who begged me not to ask until my very last breath.